Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well wherever you are in the world. And to continue through our journey of the works of John Carpenter, directed by the one, the only John Carpenter, I'd like to stop by the episode that he directed for the very memorable series, Masters of Horror. And this is the episode which was originally broadcast in 2006. It goes by the title, Pro-Life. So this was originally aired in 2006 under the anthology horror series Masters of Horror. This is the second of two episodes directed by John Carpenter from a script by Drew McWeeny and Scott Swan, who incidentally also penned the script for John Carpenter's other earlier episode for this particular series, Masters of Horror, that being Cigarette Burns. Well, here we have the same script writers coming up with quite an intense work that has a lot going on in it. It is very disturbing, and I think in many ways it has a real opportunity for John Carpenter to make a statement, a real brutal, almost quite a vicious statement in many respects as far as his own filmmaking is concerned, and it's quite memorable for that respect, and other respects I might add. But it's also a very complex work, and I think there is much thought going on in here, which hopefully I'll try to get into in the second half of this video. But before I get into that, let me just focus in on this particular UK DVD release, UK DVD release, which is in this set, Starz Home Entertainment Anchor Bay on the back, Masters of Horror. And this is a particular DVD set. It's not the entire series, but it's one segment of one of the seasons. Included in this particular segment, of course, is the episode Pro-Life. Again, this is a UK DVD. And so what we have on this particular release of this episode, on this UK DVD, are the following. So first we have the audio commentary track given by the scriptwriters Scott Swan and Drew McWeeny and John Carpenter. So they are together in one particular audio commentary track, and it's great to see the screenwriters and the director interact. They're talking about how this is similar to their production of Cigarette Burns about a year prior, but also there are differences. One of the things they talk about in particular is the work by the Cody Carpenter, and the musical score, which is very important, has a very almost a sound effects type of ambient sound quality to it, but is also very pulsating, very driving, and very effective. And we also saw, of course, Cody Carpenter doing the score for the other John Carpenter directed episode for this series, that being Cigarette Burns. And so they talk about that. They also talk about the actors. They talk about certain effects shots that were used, certain choices that were made by the actors' performances, certain key scenes in this particular work, etc., etc. It's always great to hear John Carpenter talk. It's always great to hear the screenwriters talk and them exchange ideas. But John Carpenter he's really sort of in control, and he is a master at this. And there's a point in the commentary that he just gets up and has a little bit of a cigarette break. And so it's a very amusing thing, and he leaves the screenwriters there to continue on for the commentary track for that next, whatever it is, 2, 3, 4 minutes or so. so, and then John Carpenter returns, and then the commentary track with the three of them resumes. It's quite an engaging moment, and I think it's such a great way to show a kind of laid-back character that I think John Carpenter is. Again, he's very honest, he is very modest, and he also shows a lot of sincerity as well, and good faith sincerity in terms of his engagement and what he's talking about, and the effects shots, and the difficulty of certain setups and that sort of thing. Really, really well done. Any commentary track with John Carpenter is, of course, highly recommended. And then there is a supplemental feature called Baby Steps, Birthing the FX Sequence, and this is about 5 minutes, and this is basically a behind-the-scenes supplement together with interviews with certain of the actors, and they're talking, and also crew, and they're talking about specific aspects of one particular scene, which I won't get into now, but it's a very, very key scene with respect to this particular work. And so again, it's highly recommended. And then there is a longer supplement, about 14 minutes, which is called Final Delivery, which is a making of documentary, the making of pro-life. And this is also going into the story, the background, certain themes that are being approached by this work, and also the participants, the actors and the crew members involved in creating this very intense, scary work. So this is called Final Delivery, Making of Pro-Life. And then there is a stills gallery, which is composed of approximately 28 stills. And this is one where you can press the button and go forward and go back to maneuver through this particular stills gallery. Again, stills galleries I think are really very good, because having stills and being able to stop and pause and look at them is still something that I think is very useful, or potentially useful anyway. And so it's really good to have this. And then there is a short, or somewhat abbreviated, written out biography of John Carpenter, again in a kind of picture gallery fashion, photo gallery fashion. You just press forward and backwards to maneuver through that. And then there's a DV-ROM feature, wherein if you access the DV-ROM features, it'll give you a facsimile of the screenplay, again by Guini and Swan. So those are the supplements that we find on this particular UK DVD release of this particular episode, Pro-Life, from Masters of Horror. Okay, so with that, my friends, what I'd like to do is I'd like to suggest to you that if you are okay with the horror genre and you are a fan of the works of John Carpenter and you have not seen this particular work yet, please, I suggest that you stop this video right now, because from here on in, I will be talking about certain specific aspects of this particular episode, including spoilers, of course. And so I encourage you, again, if you are okay with this genre and John Carpenter works and you haven't seen this, I encourage you to stop this video, find this particular episode, watch it, and then you can always come back at any time, and it'll be my pleasure to hear your thoughts about this particular episode of Masters of Horror called Pro-Life. I must say that it is a very, very intense work. I mean this. This is very intense. This is one of the most intense John Carpenter works I think we've seen in a long time. And so I must warn you in advance, and there are some quite difficult and unpleasant things that go on. Some of it we see on screen, but a lot of it is left to our imagination, which I think is even more frightening. And so just be sure that you are okay with intense, very challenging works, because this is certainly one of the most intense, challenging works in this particular series, but just in general. I should say also that this episode is one that is dealing with the very sensitive topic of abortion. Now, it is dealing with it in a very direct way, And this might not necessarily, therefore, be a particular episode that is for everyone. And so if you are of the position that you do not necessarily want to have the things that you watch deal with sensitive topics like this, then most certainly this particular work is not for you, and you shouldn't feel obliged to have to watch it if you don't want to. But I will suggest, however, that, as I will try to explain in the latter half of this video, that I do think that the work, although it does talk about a very, very sensitive and controversial topic, it does so in a way that I think leaves enough room for both sides or many sides of the particular issue to find voice. And even though the work is ultimately also a kind of horror genre work, and therefore there are certain horror genre traits that are expressed in the work, still there is a kind of sense of the characters given room to develop and grow, such that we can reasonably look at this work and say that it is dealing with a sensitive topic in a way that is not necessarily giving sides, one side more strength over the other. Let me put it that way. And so I do think it is dealing with this particular topic in it's doing it in, of course, a horror genre realm, but it's also doing it in a way that is not disrespectful to the particular sensitivity of the issue. That being said, I do think also that if you are uncomfortable with this kind of subject matter, then I would strongly not recommend you watch this particular episode. But if you are okay with that kind of subject matter and dealt with in a way that is, as I was trying to suggest earlier, then of course it is certainly worth checking out. Just be sure that you're okay with that. But if you are, my friends, then and you are okay with and you're a fan of John Carpenter's works, of course, but you haven't seen this episode, please check it out, and then you can come back at any time, at which point it'll be my pleasure to hear your thoughts about this episode from Masters of Horror called Pro-Life. Okay, my friends, so you're back, which means you have seen this episode from Masters of Horror called Pro-Life. And I must say from the outset that this is a very intense work. I mean, when I watch this episode, whenever I watch this episode, I just tense up, because from the get-go, it is dealing with many things that I find very uncomfortable. And every time I watch it, I marvel at how uncomfortable this makes me feel. And it does so for a number of reasons. First, it is talking about the way in which the body is being affected and the vulnerability of the human body, especially when we're dealing with medicine and doctors, and in this case, the idea or this idea of childbirth, and how that leaves us very vulnerable. And so there are many aspects of this in terms of what might be termed to be, I don't know, for lack of a better phrase, perhaps a kind of body horror. But I mean that in the sense of the way in which the human body is being affected, both by external evil things like demons or giving birth to monster babies, or also other things in terms of human implemented surgical means by which to carry out procedures of abortion. And so these things, I think, are not left up in terms, and they're not left up to be sort of swept under the rug or anything like that, but rather these things are brought to the fore in a very almost, and I mean this in a positive way, almost confrontational way, but also in a way that doesn't necessarily avert one's gaze when one is watching it. And there are some scenes in particular that are very disturbing and very shocking. I must say that this makes this film or this work quite intense indeed. So let's just think about that and try to break it down. So I think this intensity can be basically sourced from three sections or three subcomponents of this particular work. There could be more, but primarily I see three subcomponents which I think form this overall intense and very shocking work in many respects. So first of those subcomponents is this idea of a siege and the way in which violence and arms are used against a particular location. And we've seen this play out in many other John Carpenter works in the past. Most strikingly, of course, in Assault on Precinct 13 and Ghosts of Mars, as well as other similar sorts of films. And this, in turn, comes from classical Hollywood traditions, Western traditions, especially Howard Hawks films. And so we see not only a through line with the classical Hollywood tradition, but we also see a through line with John Carpenter's own prior works, the siege action film. And there is a great deal of intensity here because we are dealing with an abortion clinic as part of the plot of this film, and we are also dealing, therefore, with people who are bystanders in this particular clinic. People who work there, or people who are patients there, etc. And then suddenly there is this attack from the outside, which is not, at first anyway, which is not an attack from a demon or a monster, but is in fact an attack from the father, the Dwayne character played by Ron Perlman, and his three children, with respect to the young woman, his daughter, Angelique, who is inside. And so, and the idea of them wanting to protect the unborn child that she is carrying, and now she is currently inside this particular premises. So they have to somehow make their way in, and they ultimately, the father in particular, makes the decision based on what he perceives to be faith in God, but we realize it's something else, and he realizes it's something else by the end of the work. But he doesn't know that during the film or the work. He thinks it's faith in God and what God is telling him to do, to protect the baby, in his words. And so this leads him, of course, to make the decision, the very shocking decision, to basically try to break into the clinic using weapons and relying on his sons to essentially kill the security guard outside, and also to shoot their way through, and then to try to attack the doctor here, so Dr. Kiefer. And that leads to a standoff inside, and also leads to some very vicious moments that we see the father carry out in terms of what it is he provides to the overall thrust of the narrative. So in this way, I would say that there is a real source of intensity in that we get this inherent intensity from the siege film genre, which we did see in, for example, Assault on Precinct 13, but we get it here as well in this very enclosed setting, but one that is driven by the real menace and peril and real fright that is achieved by the towering performance by Ron Perlman here as the father. So let me just stop here and just try to extrapolate upon that, which is to say that I did mention that this does feel like a past John Carpenter work, like Assault on Precinct 13, where we have an outside menace trying to make their way inside a particular fixed setting. But I would actually suggest also that, unlike films like Assault on Precinct 13 or even Ghosts of Mars, I would say that this particular work, Pro-Life, does something a little bit different than what we saw in those past John Carpenter works. What it does is, not only do we get the siege element, but we also get the siege element with both sides more or less being portrayed and being given time for development. So we get the side of the clinic, and we have the doctors inside, for example, The characters played by Mark Fierstein, O'Shea, and Emmanuel Vaugier, the Kim character, and also the doctor, Dr. Kiefer, and then also some of the other people who are waiting in the lobby, and also the other people who work there. And so we get their side of it, and also Angelique, the young woman, of course. So we get their side of it, and I think because they are the subject of the siege, we see that perhaps they are the side that one might be naturally inclined as a viewer to sympathize with. And then we have the outside forces moving in, those being led by the father and then brought along by the children, the sons. But what is so interesting about this is that even the sort of quote-unquote antagonist side, as represented by the Ron Perlman character, is still given a certain sense of, how shall we put it, a certain sense of character exposition. He is not presented in a way that, for example, I would say, characterizes his religious beliefs. And I think John Carpenter makes a point of this in the commentaries, that he wanted, very importantly, to not portray his particular character, who is very religious, but he did not want to portray this particular character as being a caricature, or he didn't want to make fun of this particular character. He wanted the Ron Perlman character to have an almost, in a very almost interesting way, his own dignity. And Ron Perlman plays the character such that it's almost like, in his mind, he thinks that he is the hero of the work, which is an interesting way of playing it, of course, because then, therefore, it gives his character, while, of course, undoubtedly his character carries out acts that are really vicious and very, very terrible, culminating, of course, in that really unbelievably unsettling and quite terrible moment that he the act that he commits on the doctor around the midpoint, or around towards the end of the work, which is probably one of the most disgusting things that I've come across in any John Carpenter work. But it's if you look at it, it's done more or less off camera. In other words, the horror is never depicted on screen. It's all left up to our own imagination, which is helped along, of course, by the power of the performances, sound effects, the music, the cutting, etc. So we get a little bit of a blood aftermath, but it's not really any kind of direct shot of anything unpleasant, if you know what I mean. But it's all left up to our imagination, which is utterly frightening and disgusting and really, really disturbing. So this is the culmination of the Ron Perlman character's really vicious acts. But despite his vicious acts, or despite his acts which are very, very violent and lead to death and murder, there is still, arguably, of course, a kind of twinge of I wouldn't necessarily call it. Well, let me say that it's not as though he is completely portrayed 100% as a villain. Let's put it that way. There is a sense that there is a kind of room that John Carpenter is giving his character to develop in a way that we can see what it is he is about. We can see the kind of relationship he has with religion, and what he perceives to be his relationship with a higher being, and his relationship with his children and his sons, as well as his daughter, and also the relationship that he ultimately has, and the realization that he finds out in terms of, indeed, what was giving him his sort of quote unquote divine intervention was nothing except a very sinister looking demon, which we find out at the very end. And so, and you see his reaction when he gets this realization at the very end. It's a very almost human moment. Again, I'm not sure if we're necessarily meant to wholly sympathize with his particular actions, because, as I say, his actions are very violent, and in many ways he is perhaps the monster of the film. But that being said, his character is still given room to grow, and room to, maybe not grow, but room for us to see his character breathe, and to see what it is that is motivating him. And there is, in a very interesting way, a kind of dignity that is provided in the portrayal of this particular character. But of course, that shouldn't take away from the fact that, yes, his acts are very, very almost unforgivable. Not almost, they are unforgivable in the sense that they are very, very terrible, very disgusting, very unpleasant. And so, but there is an interesting way that it's being played here. And so I find that complexity to be something that is putting an almost spin on the siege genre that we have seen up to now. We have seen past films of John Carpenter in the siege genre where we had, let's say, maybe a little bit of backstory of the attackers. We get a sense of where they come from, more or less, but we never really got this sense of relationships that motivated them, kind of religious beliefs that motivated them. We never get a sense of that as strongly as I would suggest that we get it here in Pro-Life. So it's almost like John Carpenter is almost developing the siege genre, which he knows so well based on his own past works, and he seems to be almost taking it in a different direction. So it's similar to those past works, and yet at the same time it's different from those past works, which I find very fascinating. In any event, my friends, I think that this siege genre, action set piece or action component, combined with the real ferocious intensity of the Ron Perlman performance, I think gives this film or this work a real significant, violent, vicious edge to it and a real sense of tension. So that's one of the components I think that really works here. And then the second component is the idea that this is also a monster film or monster work. And so we have the demon, we have the birthing of the monster baby, which has very weird appendages that is just very gross looking. It's very reminiscent of something like an appendage with its own spider legs that walks around that we saw in a very famous John Carpenter film called The Thing, but it also has a different style. There's a certain way that the body and the flesh in this particular monster design is being manipulated that almost reminds us of similar types of flesh manipulation that we saw in, say, in The Mouth of Madness, and that sort of thing. So we have seen monster effects dealt with in past John Carpenter films. But as I was trying to allude to earlier, I think these monster effects are linked in to something very fundamentally intimate about the human experience, and thus, because of its fundamental intimacy, I think the fact that there is a monster element being mixed into this fundamental intimacy, I think makes the monster element even more terrifying and more intense. And that fundamental intimacy that I refer to is the idea of parenthood or motherhood or fatherhood, or this idea of a connection between a parent and a child. And the monster that rises up from beneath, basically killing the children, killing the father, and the monster itself being a father. And then we have the monster, little baby monster, being birthed, coming to life after, of course, this spectacular spew of real gross stuff that poor Kim, the character Kim, and what happens to her in a very memorable moment of the work, of course. But there is all this kind of unpleasant, gross stuff going on here, and it's combined with the real vulnerability and intense intimacy that is associated with giving birth and also parenthood. And so therefore I think this component, it's not just the monster component, but it's the monster component combined with the notion of parenthood and the intimacy and the vulnerability of parenthood that I think gives this work a real almost intense, sinister, and very suspenseful and unnerving edge. So that's the second component that I would suggest. And then the third component is somewhat related to both the two other components that I mentioned earlier, which is this idea that it's an unavoidable situation that this work involves, it to a certain degree, a story that revolves around the very sensitive topic of abortion. Now, I would suggest that this particular topic is one that is certainly not for everyone. I mean, it's a very uncomfortable topic to begin with, and so one can look at this work and consider it to be a horror work. One can look at this work and consider it to be a John Carpenter work. But it is a John Carpenter work, and it is a horror work that deals with, in its story and its narrative, the concept of an abortion clinic and the doctors that work there and what it is they do. Now, I would suggest that, of course, for anyone who is uncomfortable with this kind of subject matter, you need not watch this, or you need not like this, or you can, have stronger feelings than dislike. Of course, that is perfectly within, that is your own prerogative, and of course, you're free to feel any way you feel, because, as I say, this is a very, very difficult and sensitive topic. But I would also suggest that, given the sensitivity of the topic, it does seem like, while it might not be the be-all, end-all statement as to the sort of political and social ramifications of this very difficult subject matter, it does still provide a kind of presentation of a story that relies on this part of let's say, modern society, and it relies on this aspect of society in a way that I would suggest doesn't necessarily go one way or the other in terms of a what do you call it, a sort of political statement. I think, in other words, the way in which the subject matter is being dealt with can be seen to be falling on this side of the particular debate or that side of the particular debate. And so I don't see it as being favoring one side or the other. Even with the character of the Ron Perlman character, he does acts that are very, very vicious, very violent. And so it might be tempting to look at his point of view, which is, I think, for a lack of subtlety, perhaps, it can be interpreted to be the stance of the pro-life stance. And so I think we can look at his acts as being perhaps the filmmakers maybe making a political statement with respect to the pro-life stance. But actually, I don't think that's what's going on at all. I think that what it's really representing is this idea that this position is still being respected. And I think there is a really interesting interplay with the doctors in the clinic, this idea that religion is not being made fun of. And this idea, I'm not saying that religion is the source of this entire political debate, of course. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm just talking about it in the context of the story here, because it's undoubtedly the case that the Ron Perlman character is very religious, as is the Angelique character, I might add, the daughter character. And so that provides an interesting dynamic as well. So it's not as though religion is dictating one particular viewpoint against the other. In fact, religion is occupying both viewpoints here. If we look at the father representing the sort of pro-life stance, and then the daughter, Angelique, representing the pro-choice stance, because it is she, in the course of the story, who is urging the doctors at the clinic to basically abort this particular thing that she is carrying, which we end up finding out that is something that is not of this world. Exactly what it is, we're not quite sure. But she is also very religious. And so she sees her position based on religion. The father sees his position based on religion. So it's not the case that the filmmakers seem to be suggesting that it is religion that is pointing one direction or another, but it seems to be very reasonably occupying both poles and both sides. And so I think we can look, therefore, at the Ron Perlman character's position, and we can say that even though he does carry out acts in the end that are very disturbing, very sinister, his position is still one that I think is given enough room for a certain level of, let's say, respect from the filmmakers. In other words, we can look at his position and we can look at what he ends up doing, and we can kind of differentiate between the two. And so therefore I don't think the film or the work is necessarily casting its eye downward against this particular concept or this particular argument of the very sensitive topic and debate that is this particular societal issue. So this is all to say that I think the way that the issue is being presented is in a way that is not necessarily giving a conclusion one way or the other, but it is really maintaining a sense of complexity, and it is also trying its best to give room for each side to essentially grow and develop as the narrative progresses. And so, but there is still this very inherent tension and quite a disturbing tension coming from this, because I think also the work does not provide a very clear answer either way. And I think that refusal to provide a very clear answer is, I think, a very brave choice, but also consequently, it is also one that leaves a lot of questions, and it also has no clear answers to those deeply disturbing questions that it leaves as the film or the work ends. And so I think this, therefore, is the third component of the three sort of components that I think overall make this work very disturbing and very effective and quite an intense work in John Carpenter's oeuvre. It is, as I say, very complicated. It is not for everyone, but it does, I think, show us a way that, on the one hand, as I was suggesting, is very similar to John Carpenter's past, but also, I think, going in a very unique, different direction, and one that does not leave room for a lot of clear and comfortable answers, which I think makes it even more horrifying and more disturbing. This is one of those, a very strong work from John Carpenter and company. And again, it might not necessarily be for everyone, especially considering its subject matter, but it is one that I would still say exists as a work that is still very thought-provoking, and because of its thought-provoking nature, it still remains very disturbing, very vicious, and a very almost, and I mean this in an artistically respectful way, a very dark turn in the subject matter that is being dealt with in the world of the direction of John Carpenter. And therefore I find it, in terms of an artistic trajectory in John Carpenter's filmography, a very interesting turn indeed, and one that I think really highlights of quite strongly, quite prominently, the work that we can now classify John Carpenter's work as being during this particular period in the 2000s. So this is the episode Pro-Life from Masters of Horror. It is very deeply disturbing and an intense work indeed. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so what do you think? Have you seen this episode? If so, what do you think about it? I'd love to hear your thoughts about this very disturbing and potentially controversial episode in the comments section below. Yes, and we can go from there. And so with that, my friends, I will leave you for now, and I will see you again in this particular series where we will talk about the film The Ward. So I look forward to seeing you there. And then after that, I will try to provide a video summing up the journey that was John Carpenter's filmography. We are almost at the end, my friends. I'm almost sad to say that, because I would love to have this keep going forever, of course. But we are almost at the end. So please, won't you join us for these final videos coming up. and I look forward to seeing you there as always. But in the meantime, of course, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Thank you once again for your time, and cheers.